but where did you get this hadith from? And
So
what,
I get a
yeah.
lot of so the hadith, the controversial hadith that I wanted to discuss with you. Um I get a lot of comments from all kinds of people with all kinds of motives, right? Some not so wholesome and some more sincere. This was one that came to me. They wanted they were curious, or there was a few of them who actually requested the same thing, but one of them that I was more receptive to was someone who was curious to see what like a new reaver, especially from the West, would think about those verses. I think it's what is it? The 50 what is it? Al-Bukhari 5134 and then that first part of 304. And I myself, I am not as educated as I would like to be in certain aspects, specifically hadith. I mean, in general, everything. I have no idea what I'm doing right at all, but it's specifically hadith, and I am a little bit more leery, and I know that there's different levels of authenticity and all of that, and I know broadly speaking, a lot of people believe al-Bukhari is one of the more authentic hadiths, and so I was curious for your perspective as someone who's very knowledgeable on these factors. And also, I mean, as a person of like great character, as mashallah, as I can tell. So I'm curious what your thought is in terms of
Okay.
those.
Probably one way of going about it is that I start making comments of my understanding about it. The other way of doing it would be that you first come up with your reservations. Where do you find yourself uncomfortable? And then I come up with my, call it brief response to overall understanding of the whole concept. And then you start asking me more questions. So probably I think I would like you to begin the proceedings by mentioning what exactly is the problem in your opinion.
Okay, so I guess with al-Bukhari 5134, this one, I mean, I'm curious of it myself also, but also trying to speak on behalf of a lot of like the, I guess, Western viewpoint of things.
Most of them are Muslims or non-Muslims or what? They mix.
So that came to me from both, actually. There was someone who was definitely not sincere, and I was like, okay, I see what you're trying to do. You're not even open. This conversation's over. I'm not interested. But then someone else said, like, Assalamu alaikum, this and thing. I'm curious to see what your thought is on this, knowing that I come from a Western society and I'm a reaver and that sort of thing. So with al-Bukhari 5134, talking about how the Prophet, peace be upon him, it was, I think, Aisha, right? Referring to her getting married when she was 6 years old, consummated the marriage when she was 9. And then that's kind of what that says, or at least the English translation. And so I guess in terms of the general reservation, specifically, especially in the Western world, I mean, everywhere consent, is important. But in the Western world, they're big on the age of consent, which is at least, arbitrarily speaking, 18, not arbitrarily, but like that was the cutoff black and white age. Some people say it should even be like 21 and that sort of thing. But otherwise, especially in Western society, especially nowadays, the thought of pedophilia is like the absolute worst. And so it's kind of one of those things where if anything is like less than that 18 age, they immediately go to, this is a like pedophile, abuser, that sort of thing. That's what they attribute it to. And so understandably, with that kind of perspective of, okay, no matter how great of a person it is, especially like in our media and our government our government. There's a lot of older gentlemen who do horrible, horrible things with children and that sort of thing. And that's a huge concern for a lot of Western folks and, Muslims and reverts and that sort of thing. So I've heard that be a topic of not contention, but for a lot of Muslims, it's like, oh, I don't know how to, like, obviously all these horrible things attributed to people who are
I
involved with
think that
someone younger,
it is something serious. Now just hear me out, and then whatever
Yes.
comes to your mind, please let me know if what I'm saying doesn't make sense to you. Mary, when we look at religion, look at Islam, my first question to myself and to everybody else is, why did you go for this decision of Islam? I mean, in my case, obviously, I was a born Muslim, but I wasn't convinced. So I struggled and I tried to understand. And basically, I was looking for the truth. Now, when you are looking for the truth, how do you know that what you've accepted is the truth? What tools do you have that you make use of to come to that conclusion? I think the only correct answer is that it is the honest use of our intellect that causes us to be inclined to accept a certain message to be from God. When you are convinced, by conviction, I don't mean 100% conviction. You have an overwhelming inclination that this message is making sense. And then obviously your inner self, your heart also gets satisfaction, contentment, etc. Now, the reason I'm coming from here is that when you accept Islam, the next question that would come to you as somebody who is using his intellect properly, honestly, and is not influenced by, shall I call it, propaganda or strong views coming from people. You've got to be absolutely independent, even if it isolates you and you are completely cut off from everybody else. Your concern should be that you should know the truth. Now, the fact of the matter is that the message of Islam, as communicated by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was primarily done through the Quran. The Quran is a book of God which was completely preserved. I mean, if you look at the manner it was preserved, there is no other example in the history of humankind. There is a text was preserved in that way. It was human memory that was primarily involved. And scores of people knew the Quran from A to Z in the first generation, and hundreds and thousands of them in the later generations. So there was no chance of it having gone wrong. Alongside the Quran, there is another source which preceded the Quran, which is called the Sunnah. The religious practices of the Prophet, which the Prophet practiced, his companions practiced, all of them. And when they left this world, the next generation had already started practicing them. So about the Quran, there was unanimity, complete unanimity. And that unanimity, complete agreement, transmitted to the next generations without any interruption. So it's uninterrupted continuity. The first concept is ijma, unanimity. And the second is tawatur, uninterrupted continuity. These two criteria are met by the Quran and the Sunnah. We say 5 times prayers because that's how it started happening during the lifetime of the Prophet. And then the next generation followed. there has been no single day, not even a single prayer, which was missed out by the Muslims. It's coming with, uninterrupted continuity. Likewise, the fasting on the month of Ramadan, likewise Hajj, likewise Friday prayers, likewise funeral prayers, likewise many other things, they are mentioned as Sunnah. The Quran and the Sunnah are God's religion. They are the two basic fundamental pillar sources of Islam. Full stop. Everything else, and I'm absolutely clear, everything else is human effort. These two sources are God-given, meticulously put across by the Prophet on behalf of the Almighty to the entire first generation and through them to the entire humanity. Sadly, Mary, this reality has not been appreciated by even a large number of Muslims. You know why? The reason is that in the 3rd century Hijrah, about 200 plus years after the demise of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, there were some outstanding people who did something which was amazing, remarkable, that they were able to bring about books which mentioned the statements and the experiences of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, in a way that they worked so hard at it. They spent their lifetimes in gathering that information and putting them down in those books, and then informing us that Bukhari heard it from A, who heard it from B, who heard it from C, and who in turn heard it from D, and D claims that he heard it from a companion, mentions his name, and he said that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said such and such thing. Now, there are at least 4 individuals between Bukhari and the companion. And Bukhari, why is he well known? Why is he so respected? Because he invested his entire lifetime gathering this information. And imagine, it is said out of something like 70,000 such reports, he finally came up with 7,000, rejecting the rest of 63,000 that he came across. Now, this book created such an impact on the Muslims. They got so impressed that now we have, wow, not only the Quran and Sunnah, but the statements of the Prophet, may God mercy be on him as well. And the end result was, and I'm saying it with all responsibility, the end result was that the Quran receded to the position of a secondary text, and Hadith became the main text of Islamic learning, of Muslim inspiration. Because, people would say that, do you know more Quran or the Prophet? This is what the Prophet said. And where did they come to learn about the fact that the Prophet said such and such thing? In Hadith. Where did Hadith come from? Bukhari, Muslim. Who are these people? Well, they are the ones who were there in the 3rd century Hijrah. Can you imagine? And they did this task, tremendous task. I have no doubt about it. I have lots of respect for them. But let's face it, it was not given to us by the Prophet. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, is not responsible for Quran, for Bukhari, for Muslim. He is responsible for the Quran. He is responsible for the Sunnah. That's my first point. I'm not saying that I'm not responsible to explain Hadith. But what I'm saying is that this reality must be there in the minds of all those who want to understand the Islam properly. Otherwise, it's a complete confusion, mix up. You know, everything is put together, jumbled in a way that you don't even know what the truth is. And honest to God, Hadith is presented in the same vein as the Quran is presented. My goodness, this is a huge problem. The Quran is the ultimate authority. The Quran calls itself the criterion, the source that distinguishes right from wrong. So our position is that Hadith, unlike the Quran and Sunnah, are a human effort, a brilliant effort, but like all other human efforts, it has its own problems and flaws. We are not trying to plead the case for rejecting Hadith completely. Not at all. We'll be losers if we do that. But Hadith has to be placed in its right position. And you know what that position is? It's a footnote of the Quran and Sunnah. And a footnote must agree with the text and not the other way around. Unfortunately, what has happened is that Muslims in general are trying to fit the Quran into Hadith. And
Why do you think that is? Like, what do you think it is about? Because I think one of my hesitations about it, and I don't necessarily reject the Hadiths, it's more, my whole rule of thumb is very Quran-centric, not necessarily Quran only, but close-ish to that. And if there's a Hadith, like for prayer, for example, praying in, through A, B, C, D steps won't harm anyone. It doesn't really have a potential for harm or anything. And so I feel like there's no issue with implementing that. But if there's a Hadith that is something that could theoretically have the potential to harm, then I'm more hesitant to blindly follow that. And I think one of the things is, because I looked into a lot of religion, I think one of the things that really appealed to me about Islam compared to like Christianity and all those others is the fact that it is preserved, and it's a central tenet of Islam to preserve the Quran and to keep it, like the sanctity of it. Because that was one thing growing up. I thought, okay, well, even if, say, the Bible or something was the word of God, it's like a game of telephone. It's been retranslated. It's been, put together by humans, by people. And so when I think of the Hadith and, it's so-and-so talk to so-and-so, talk to so-and-so, talk to so-and-so, there's like 4 or 5 degrees of separation from the Prophet, peace be upon him. To me, I just think, okay, well then, like, what is the big difference between that and, say, something like the Bible, which is, God's word, but just has, lost some of its meaning over the years and just, mistranslations and that sort of thing. What is the big difference? Granted, I mean, I know there's like a whole line of authenticity and stuff like that, but my thought with that is, even if, that, like what you're saying with Bukhari, if there's 4 or 5 degrees of separation, even if all of those people are completely stand-up people who have great character and have sincere integrity, there's still the human fact of, if I tell you something that my good friend said 10 years ago to me, I am recalling it to the best of my ability with honesty, and I will not lie to you. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate, simply because without any malicious intent. So what I'm saying with that is, with those separate people, even if they're wonderful, incredible, very honest people, there's still that human element of, I mean, we know, like, we can create false memories and just over time, so I'm having not issues, but I'm having trouble with that, in the sense of, how people elevate the Hadith, like literally almost above the Quran.
It's very interesting that what you are saying is spot on. And yet, you, being somebody who is a newcomer, are making this statement with so much of care, you're so hesitant
Yeah.
because of that propaganda that hadith is claimed to be the statement of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. Not at all. I mean, if that's the case, then obviously you have to be a disbeliever to say no to it. It's not his statement. It's a claim that he made that
Claim
statement.
to his statement.
And that claim, and this is not me saying it, it's Bukhari saying it. When Bukhari says that I heard it from A, who heard it from B, who heard it from C, who heard it from D, and D says that he heard it from the companion, then obviously Bukhari is trying to convince us that, I've got a proof of it. Now, it's a human effort. Now, I'll just give you one example. There's hundreds of examples which can show you the fact that despite the fact that a person is absolutely honest, he's intelligent, bright, knowledgeable, he or she can still go wrong. Why? Because when I will narrate what I've talked to you, to Talha, my son, for example, I'm sure that I'll be at best 70-80% spot on.
Right, exactly.
20% is going to come from my own side. Because
right.
I am looking at what you are saying from my position, from my perspective. Now, I'll give you an example. There was no Bukhari. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, had left only a few years earlier. There was a companion, famous companion. It was probably either Umar or his son, Abdullah ibn Umar. One of the two said something which was mentioned before Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. What was mentioned to her was that Abdullah is saying that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said that if you cry on somebody's death, then the person who dies, he is pained, he gets uncomfortable. Now, when this piece of information came to Aisha, immediately she said, may God forgive this man, Abdullah, he's a nice man, but he is absolutely wrong. This cannot be true. Because the Quran says, nobody is going to bear the burden of another. How is it possible that if somebody is crying at the death of somebody else and the person who is dead, he is going to be punished for it? It's none of his faults. So how is it possible? And then she went on to clarify. She said, actually what happened was that there was a Jew who died. And, his funeral, the procession was taking the body to the graveyard. And there were some ladies who were crying in his home. And the Prophet said that while they are crying, he is being punished. They are crying and he is being punished. The person who heard it and transmitted it to somebody else, he made the two statements, appear as if one was leading to the other. That the ladies who were crying were causing the person to be punished, although the two were independent statements. They are crying and he is being punished. In other words, probably what the Prophet said was that while they are crying because he's died, the fact of the matter is that even more tragic is the fact that he is being punished. But this gentleman, he put the two statements together as if their crying was leading for his punishment.
Causing it.
So there are hundreds of such other examples. So that was my point number one. Now let me address this very important question, because I think it's important, because either I tell Muslims, stop claiming that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was meant to be the Prophet for the entire humankind. Then I will have no problems. If you make that claim, then you must present the message in a way that people should not run away and say, oh my goodness, pedophile, we can't even listen to it. I mean, how can you make the two claims together? And they're
Exactly.
insisting at this age. Now listen to it. This mention in Bukhari, and when I've already made those statements, it really means that despite the great efforts of Bukhari, there can be problems in Bukhari. And there are problems in Bukhari. We can talk about those problems because he was a human being and he himself never claimed that what I'm saying is absolutely fault-free. He never made that claim. Now, there are a few facts. In Bukhari, it's mentioned that he got married when she was 6, and when the marriage got consummated, it was 9. And Muslim scholars take great pains in explaining that, it all depends on the climate where you're living, and in deserts, girls get mature much earlier and so on. All, I don't know, I don't want to comment. The fact of the matter is that the elder sister of Aisha, Asma, she was 10 years older, which is, it was a known fact. When she died when she was 100 years old. She had a pretty long life. And she died because you know that in the Muslim community, they normally resort to the Hijrah calendar. So she died in the year 72 Hijrah. Hijrah is the year when the Prophet migrated from Mecca to Medina.
Oh, okay.
That's the year when the Muslim calendar begins.
Is that that's like year 0, year 1?
Yeah. That's what I said. That Bukhari and Muslim belong to the 3rd century Hijrah. So, that's where the Muslim calendar begins. So the Hijrah year was 0 year, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So the Prophet died in the 11th Hijrah. So she died in the year 72 Hijrah. You know what that means? It means that at the time of Hijrah, her age was 28. And
this is Aisha, is what you're saying, or the
Asma.
Sister? Oh, the sister. Okay.
Her elder sister. And therefore, Aisha's age was 18 when she migrated. And therefore, a year later, when the marriage got consummated, her age was 19. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that in Arabic language, when you come to numbers, there is a very interesting feature of Arabic language that when you move from 10 onwards, 10 to 19, these 9 numbers, 11 to 19, they are mentioned in a way that the same numbers 1 to 9 are repeated and 10 is added. You see, so for instance, 1 is Wahid or Ahad, and 11 is Ahada Ashara. 2 is Ithna, and 12 is Ithna Ashara. You get the point? So Ashara is repeated. In other words, if you say it in English, 11 is 1 and 10. 12 is 2 and 10. 13 is 3 and 10. That's how it is in Arabic. It's a little crude,
Interesting.
So, 13 is Thalatha Ashara. That's how it is. So in Arabic, it's quite common that when you have such expressions, it's actually true in all languages, and you use certain words frequently, you drop the obvious part of a word, which is pretty well known. I know that you know it, that when I'm saying something, a part of it has been dropped. omitted because
Mm-hmm.
it's obvious.
Mm-hmm.
So quite often the Arabs, when they would mention numbers, and they would know that they're saying, let's say, Sabah, seven. And they
Mm-hmm.
know that it's 17. I don't have to say Sabah Shara. I mean, I don't know if I need to repeat it because it's going to take longer. You shorten your expression. So that's
Interesting.
another matter. So when
Hmm.
it was said that she was 6, it was actually 16. And when the narrator said she was 9, it was 19. And the 10 years were omitted because it was obvious. I mean, people were talking to each other. It was not that there was something special happening. It was just an information transmitted to another person, and in the local colloquial language, the way you would normally speak. That's point number 2. Point number 3: the gentleman who is responsible, one of the 4 people, narrators, 4 or 5 who are involved in that chain.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was, I forget his name, who was a very well-known narrator. And there are many ahadith which are attributed to him. He's known to have, transmitted lots of ahadith, and he's respected as somebody who's very reliable.
Mm-hmm.
But it is said about him that he had 2 phases in his life. One phase was before he migrated to Kufa, and the second phase was after he migrated to Kufa. When I migrated to Kufa, Kufa is a city in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And when he migrated to Kufa, he had gotten old and he had started forgetting. So he was not quite as reliable after he went to Kufa as he was before that. And it is also claimed by people who are critical of this claim that Aisha was 6 and 9 years old, respectively, when she got married and consummated, that this gentleman narrated this all-important report in Kufa, not before that. In other words, he had entered an age when he was forgetful.
Mm.
But honestly, all these points, ignore them.
Okay.
It's mentioned in Bukhari. It's not mentioned in the Quran. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, the Quran tells us that he was the sanest, the most decent of all human beings. It is unthinkable that he would have done something of that kind. There are many other evidences, but I've just mentioned 3 of them. And the fact that anything in a book of Hadith is not necessarily a fact. It has to be looked into from the point of view of the Quranic text, from the point of view of the Sunnah, which is equally reliable. Common sense. Why common sense? Because quite often, if you use your common sense, you would be able to figure out that, wait a minute, there seems to be something wrong. If it is coming from God directly, I'll just keep quiet and I'll try to understand it. But if it is coming from humans who are claiming that this is what the Prophet said, well, we'll say that just wait a minute. And I can give you, and I think it's a very, very interesting topic. We'll talk about it in our later meetings as well. I'll let you know how many concepts which Muslims developed over the centuries were developed because of their wrong understanding of Hadith. Because Hadith was understood in a way that they just picked one narrative, one statement, and ignored all others relevant to the same subject. So, for example, if I start giving you the list of problems that have emerged as a consequence, you would find many Muslim men not lowering their trousers beneath their ankles.
Mm-hmm.
They think that it's something which is required by our religion. It's not mentioned in the Quran. They get it from Hadith, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
wrong reading of Hadith. There are many Muslims, I'm sure you must have come across some of them, who would say that we are not allowed to paint pictures of living beings.
Oh, yes.
They don't do it. I mean, if you read all Hadith, and it's all from Hadith. The interesting thing is that the Quran mentions that Prophet Solomon, King Solomon, he had big paintings of living beings in his palace. But they ignore it because Hadith has actually come to dominate.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think people are so... I mean, I get eaten up in my comment section or like in my DMs when I'm say that I'm like, for that reason, I'm a little bit more hesitant on the Hadith side, because if it's something that seems to contradict the Quran, it's like I'm hesitant in that regard. So why do you think people are so protective over the Hadith and so elevate it almost higher than the Quran?
There are a number of reasons, but I would mention two of them, which probably are the most prominent.
Mm-hmm.
The first reason is, I think I don't know, it's more of call it psychological reason. You know, in your mind, if you think about something,
mm-hmm.
that's how it is, and it's hammered over and over again, that's how it is, you start believing it.
Mm-hmm.
So over these last 12 centuries, 11 centuries, Muslims have been believing that Hadith is the statement of the Prophet, which, as I said to you, is wrong. If you look at the claim of Bukhari and Muslim, it is a claim that Hadith is what the Prophet said. So I keep telling Muslims that, you know, what you're doing is a huge blunder. When you quote Hadith, you know what you say? You say, this is what the Prophet said. And it's unfair, Mary, it's unfair that you say that this is what the Prophet said. You know what they should say? I tell them that what they should say is that Bukhari said, I heard it from Urwa. Who heard it from Abdullah? Who heard it from Zaid? Who heard it from Abdul Rahman? Who heard it from Abu Huraira? And he said that this is what the Prophet said. And I tell you, it would completely change the situation. People would say, oh, goodness me, there are 5 people involved. No, what they're doing? They're just saying the Prophet said. What do you mean the Prophet said? He did not say that.
Right.
We know that's not the case. Did you hear him say that?
Right, exactly. Did he text you?
With all respect to you, with all respects to you, Mary, if you will come to me and say that I heard the Prophet say that, well, I say, wait a minute, I have my own reservations. You know? I have a few questions to ask. I didn't hear him myself. Mm-hmm. There are 5 people. That's one reason. That they have actually somehow learned, trained to believe that Hadith is the statement of the Prophet. And when Prophet says something, that's the ultimate. That's what they believe. Not realizing that even if the Prophet said exactly the same words, it's still not enough because we don't know the concept. We don't know the concept. I mean, if, for instance, we come to learn about the fact that somebody tells us that the Prophet said, yeah, go and kill him. So it's incomplete. I mean, kill whom? Why? What is the context?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. The second reason is people incorrectly think that if we take away Hadith from the sources of Islamic learning, then our religion would be incomplete. We'll not even be able to say our prayers. Because they say that we learned our prayers from Hadith. Mm-hmm. And I tell them that that's wrong. We have not learned our prayers from Hadith. I learned my prayers from my elders, who learned their prayers from their elders. It's Sunnah, it's not Hadith. Now, Hadith, because it's the description of the Prophet's life. Obviously, a part of Hadith's description is the description of prayer. But we didn't We didn't learn prayers from Hadith. What were the people in the first 200 years of Muslim history were doing? Where were they getting their religion from?
Because are you saying so Hadith didn't come about, or Hadith didn't come about until 200 years after?
Until 200 plus years later.
Oh, see, that's okay. So then that's interesting. So
So
what
a
is the
very valid
difference?
question to such people is, what were the people in the first 2 centuries of Muslim history doing? And you
What
know
were they
what they'll
doing?
answer? You know what they'll say? The Hadith was there. Then our next question would be, then what did Bukhari do? If Hadith was already there, what
Oh,
was the
that's a good
contribution of
point.
Bukhari? The problem is that, we know this, that humans are very complex.
Mm-hmm.
If you fall in love with an ideology, you will defend it no matter what. But then you'll not remain honest.
That's the thing.
Honesty demands that you critically examine. And that's why I'm so keen that you don't lose your, critical approach towards understanding Islam. Because it's very tempting for Muslims to come to anybody who is new, to just bombard him or her with information and with, narratives and with emotional blackmailing tactics.
Yeah, 100%. Seriously, like real talk. It's crazy.
So that's Hadith. That's point number one. Do you want to talk about the other issue as well?
We could. I do have one question. So what would you say is the difference between the Sunnah and Hadith?
Good.
Hadith,
Very
is it
good
just
question.
the claim of Sunnah, or?
No. It's the manner Sunnah was transmitted compared to the manner Hadith was transmitted. Now, the first 2 centuries, or let's say the first 3 or 4 generations of Muslims, are very important to imagine. As far as the Sunnah is concerned, like the Quran, let's say after the first generation of Muslims left this world, the entire second generation, the entire second generation, no exception, had already started following Sunnah.
So you're talking about like 5 prayers a day.
As far as Hadith is concerned, well, there are a number of other questions. But let's assume that there were 10,000 ahadith. Not even 5% of the first generation Muslims knew what those ahadiths were. I make another bold statement. The closest of the companions of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, for instance, he did not know as many ahadith as there are in Bukhari. You know why? Because he was with the Prophet on some occasions, but not on other occasions. So obviously he couldn't have known every hadith. And I tell you another thing about Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was so careful that it is said that he probably has not narrated hadith more than 100, less than 100. And there was a very famous journey that Abu Bakr embarked upon with the Prophet. They were the only 2 people who went for this journey from Mecca to Medina. It was 7 days and 7 nights that they spent together. And this is something well known. Everybody agrees to it. The Quran also mentions it. Mentions it in an indirect way. And there is not even a single hadith from Abu Bakr telling us what happened during that journey. Why? Because, he was careful. He said, why should I? I mean, that's what his point of view must have been. I mean, the Quran is there. The Sunnah is there.
You have what you need.
What should I tell you? Why should I tell you the conversation that I had with the Prophet? But on the other hand, Abu Huraira, can you imagine Abu Huraira, who became Muslim only 2 years before the Prophet died? And he has thousands of hadith that he narrated.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Ask anybody, any Muslim, and he'll tell you the same. Abu Bakr who was a Muslim right from day one,
Yeah.
narrates not more than 100. I think it's less than 100. And Abu Hurairah, thousands. And even though he was 2 years or 3 years old as a Muslim when the Prophet died. So it's all human. It's all human.
That's where my hesitancy comes from. So Abu Hurairah, so who was he in relation to the Prophet, peace be upon him?
Well, Abu Hurairah was one of those poor young people who, because they accepted Islam, they had no means of living. So the Prophet, may God mercy be on him, arranged for them to have a place close to where he was living himself. And whatever food, etc., would come to him, he would pass on to them. And they had the opportunity of being very close to the Prophet because they were there all the time. So I'm not surprised that he narrated so many of the Hadith.
Same.
But the fact of the matter is that Abu Bakr did not. I mean, my question is that if Hadith was so important, why is that so very important journey completely ignored from being mentioned in Hadith? Because it was not done by God. It was not done by the Prophet. You see, I'm talking to you. You have a right to ignore whatever I'm saying. And if you feel like, you can talk about some of the things I've mentioned to you to your friend. It's up to you. I have not asked you to do anything. Yes, if I write a book, or if I say that, you know, what we are doing right now is going to be saved, and I want it to be distributed to others, now I take this responsibility. But if you are narrating what I'm saying, it's not my responsibility. I can actually say later that, no, Mary is wrong. I didn't say that. She didn't understand me properly.
Exactly.
So that's what Hadith is. But unfortunately, so these are the two reasons. Number one, because Hadith is taken as the word of the Prophet, the exact word of the Prophet. And therefore people are very emotional about it. I say that quite the contrary. We should be emotional about the fact that we should not narrate anything naming the Prophet unless we are absolutely confident that he actually said that. But really, you know, it really has been the complete reverse of it. And the second thing is that people say that we learned salat, prayers, zakat, and all our religion through hadith. And I said that's not true. Along with Quran, we had Sunnah, which was learned by all Muslims from day one.
And it was just passed down verbally, basically, is what I'm assuming. Yeah.
Look, Mary, if Talha is my son and he is brought up at my home, he would say that his parents are praying. And at some stage, he will start praying himself. That's how it happened. He has all along been living with us. He knows that when the month of Ramadan approaches, we start fasting. He knows that his father has to pay zakat. He knows that on Fridays we go for Jummah prayer. He knows that after the month of Ramadan we have Eid prayer, we have an Eid day, and so on. He knows that when we meet each other, we greet by saying Assalamu alaikum. All these sunnahs were transmitted by the entire first generation. You see, that's important. The entire first generation to the entire second generation. Hadith is, you know, one of the expressions used for hadith is khabar wahid. It's an information narrated by one person, one or a few persons. That's what hadith is technically called. Ask a scholar, and he would say, yes, khabar wahid is hadith.
Interesting. Okay.
So therefore, if you find something in hadith that you don't understand, don't be too disturbed. We'll explain it. We'll explain it, inshallah.
Inshallah. That makes sense. So the sunnah is more the kind of like a.
Think about it. You know, just keep this discussion in your mind and just try to figure out whether it makes sense or not. And I would suggest that now that we've already spent an hour, that part of the discussion, let's do it the next time.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds good.
About women. Yeah, we'll do it next time, inshallah.
Definitely. That sounds great.